Hello, everyone, and welcome to our magical history tour with Tim Thomas. And today we will be discussing the Hotel Del Monte with a special guest, John Sanders, a Hotel Del Monte historian. And we will have Tim Thomas lead us through this fun journey. Tim Thomas is a Monterey local historian. Just a couple housekeeping items before we turn it over to Tim and John. I'd like everyone, if you could please mute yourself during the presentation. And then if any questions arise, please feel free to enter them into the chat and we will keep track of them. And then also we'll have some time at the end for some questions. So as of that, I turn it over to you, Tim, and let's go.
All right, so you want to start that film and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I got it right now.
Very good. I'll get mine going here. All right, so everybody, hope you all can hear me. Welcome everyone to the first Monterey Magical History Tour. My name is Tim Thomas. I am a local historian. I was the historian and curator for the old Monterey Maritime Museum for many years, working with the Monterey History and Art Association, a number of other organizations. And I hope that these programs will be educational. I hope they're a little entertaining, and I hope that you all learn something new and different about Monterey and Monterey's history. And I think the Hotel Del Monte was a good place to start because the hotel, there's a lot of myths about the Hotel Del Monte, but the hotel really transformed Monterey in a lot of different ways, and some that I think might surprise you. But before we get to the hotel, let's talk a little bit about Monterey before there was a hotel. And I'm really going to back it up not that far from the hotel, but really started about 1848 when gold was discovered on the American River. And then the following year in 1849, they held the Constitutional Convention at Colton Hall. Then in 1850, California became a state. Now, what a lot of people don't know, and most people assume that Monterey was always the state capital, when it actually was not the state capital, and that was by design. The framers of the Constitution did not want Monterey to be the state capital, and this is their words. They felt that Monterey was a Mexican town, and they really wanted to get away from that idea, so they moved the state capital initially to San Jose, then it went to Benicia, then it went back to San Jose, then eventually it goes to Sacramento because gold was discovered on the American River. But one thing that kind of connects the story today and our state is, of course, all that property, and there's a connection to the Hotel Del Monte, that property up where the Del Monte Shopping Center is today, which belonged to the Del Monte Properties. That property actually was held open for many, many years. Like, they did not build that shopping center until 1969, and that was prime property in Monterey. They held that property all those years with the idea that they would bring the state capital to Monterey, and that's where they were going to put it. Well, we can thank our lucky stars that they never did that, because they had Monterey would be a completely different place today. So I introduced my guest, John Sanders. John is a good friend of mine. I've known John for many, many years. He worked for the Naval Postgraduate School for many years and in a number of different capacities, but he's also an excellent storyteller and an excellent historian, especially on the Hotel Del Monte. But John, I thought we'd touch just a little bit about Monterey in those years before they built the hotel after 1850. I mean, Monterey literally was referred to in the press in those days as Rip Van Winkle Town, the town that went to sleep.
It was indeed,
But
Tim. Yeah.
and I think some amazing things. Monterey was, it was a pretty wild place. There was saloons on every corner, and there were gambling dens and all kinds of things.
Yeah. I did a quick study, not scientific, but a quick study just to look at the business district of Monterey before Hotel Del Monte was built. And it's fascinating because saloons and stables outnumbered hotels and restaurants by far.
Yeah, Monterey was literally the Wild West
It was.
at that time. So a couple things will be happening in Monterey. We change all of this. See if I got to do this correctly now. This key literally changed the history of Monterey forever. This actually is a switch lock key for the Southern Pacific Railroad. This is the key that opened the lock to push the track to Monterey. And now you got a railroad, now you got a way to get people to Monterey. And actually, the original railroad was the Monte Valley Railroad, which was a locally owned railroad. They built that railroad initially so they could ship vegetables and fruits and mainly grains and things from the Salinas Valley and from the Central Valley of California. They bring them by train to Monterey, then they ship them by ship out of Monterey Harbor. And also they wanted to bring tourists to Monterey, but they were not financially very successful, and they're bought out in 1880 by the Southern Pacific. And John, maybe you could touch on about that a little bit, about the Southern Pacific.
Yeah, it's an interesting timeline, Tim, because the construction of the standard gauge railroad line from Castroville into Monterey began in September 1879, and about the time that Robert Louis Stevenson was in Monterey. And this was before Charles Crocker started laying any timber for the hotel. So the same person who led the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad for Crocker's Central Pacific Railroad in the 1860s was leading the construction of this small length of line. And they were just a few miles outside of Monterey by November, when a person named R.P. Hammond Sr. bought the tract of land where the hotel was built. And I want to correct a little bit of the historical record here, Tim, because every source that I ever read said that Crocker bought the land for the Del Monte from David Jacks for $5 an acre.
Right.
And by and large, that is true. However, that tract of land where the hotel was built was actually once owned by a humble carpenter. And R.P. Hammond Sr. is the person who bought that land at $46 an acre, nearly 10 times more than what Crocker paid, as the history books say. But he bought that land and then transferred it to Crocker. And that's where the hotel was built. That's where the Naval Postgraduate School is today.
Well, that was a lot of money in 1879.
A tremendous amount, yeah.
So the Southern Pacific bought out that little railroad, and they also bought about 8,000 acres of the Monterey Peninsula with this idea they could turn Monterey into a tourist paradise. Who'd think such a thing? But was it really, they always say, Charles Crocker's dream?
It was. It truly was. And to add just a bit more context, Tim, 1875, the city published a handbook, a handbook to Monterey. Sean will have that in the California History Room at the Monterey Library when the History Room reopens. Plus, it is available on
Uh-oh.
the internet. The city was so intent on trying to draw tourists that they offered 2 tracts of land free for someone who would build a hotel capable of serving basically 100 people rather than the handful of people that the available places serve. Crocker, of course, didn't take that offer up, but Hammond in 1879 bought this tract of land that became the Hotel Del Monte home site. And what you see in this graphic is the front entrance of that early hotel. In the background, you see a survey map from the 1880s showing you the basic layout of the hotel grounds, that tract of land, that oak and pine woodland once owned by a humble carpenter. And it's on this tract of land that thousands of guests started coming to Monterey from around the world. Crocker's vision for the world's most seaside reality in Hotel Del Monte.
And was this the original place where Crocker wanted to build the hotel?
It is not. It is not. He actually wanted to build at Cypress Point. Um, Jules Tavernier had done some painting in the area in the 1870s. Leland Stanford had purchased one of Tavernier's paintings of Point Lobos. It was fantastic painting. And I know Terry Trotter is on the line today, and it's great that he's here for the discussion. But Stanford and Crocker, best of friends. Crocker took this kind of image of Monterey from Tavernier's painting, and he envisioned building a resort, grand resort at Cypress Point. Now, the logistics of that would have been absolutely overwhelming. There was no water, there was no access, especially for hauling large loads of lumber and other materials for a large resort. Yeah, Cypress Point was his original goal, but he settled for this little tract of land just outside of Monterey. And the connection I think that's most amazing is that R.P. Hammond Sr. built this great macadam highway from the hotel to Cypress Point that today is known as the 17-mile drive. So Crocker did make that connection to Cypress Point. It just wasn't with a resort on the site.
Now, I understand they actually built this hotel in about 3 months. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And although I don't have the details, Tim, what I think is that everything was front loaded from the time that the rail line started going in September of 1879. I bet that there were teams already starting to fabricate materials for the hotel and ready to ship them down, because construction didn't begin until February of 1880. The title didn't, even though the property was purchased in late November, title and everything didn't clear until January. February, they start construction. There are heavy rains during that winter, intense rains. In fact, the bridge that the train was going to go over at the Salinas River got washed out, had to be rebuilt. And still, the crews managed to open the hotel in June 1880. And a short time later, R.P. Hammond Sr.'s West Point classmate, William Tecumseh Sherman, who was then the commanding general of the United States Army, he and President Rutherford B. Hayes arrived for a visit at Hotel Del Monte in September. The timeline is stunning.
And then I also want to, I know they put into this, like the gardens were very important, and they brought in a pretty well-known botanist, gardener, to put this garden in.
The botanist you're referring to, Rudolf Ulrich, he did become quite renowned, and later teamed up with Frederick Law Olmsted to do the grounds for the Great Chicago World's Fair. And he did 2 other World's Fairs after that. But Ulrich was not involved initially in 1880. And the gardeners who really made the front of this hotel look so splendid and made the grounds the envy of others around the world, those were Chinese gardeners, about 100 of them. And
Yeah, go ahead.
You're showing a photograph of the head gardener with his family. This is Ni Li. And one of the great treats that I had while working at the Naval Postgraduate School was to have descendants of Ni Li just pop into my office one day. And they gave me this photograph along with some others.
Yeah, I know over the years there were also a number of Japanese gardeners working in the gardens there as well.
Yes.
But Chinese laborers who I believe also played a big role in building the hotel. And of course, they built the dam on Carmel Valley and the water line that ran all the way to the valley to the hotel. In 1882, they built that reservoir up on David Avenue.
And they were
the
construction crew for the railroad as well.
Absolutely. They wouldn't exist without these guys today.
Right.
And there's also another picture of this hotel.
Yes.
What I like about the hotel is what's interesting to me, I'm going to back up to this picture again, it was advertised as a winter hotel. So it marketed the hotel to the rich folks that lived in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Hey, get those cold winters. Come to Monterey. Spend a couple of months here at the Hotel Del Monte. A lot of folks would do that.
They did. I imagine it took about 2 weeks one way to travel from, say, Boston, Philadelphia, or New York to Monterey in the 1880s. And what you find is that not only did individuals and small groups make that trip, and they stayed for extended time, sometimes even seasons, but tour groups started forming that made these long trips. One person who stayed as not necessarily for a season, but for a winter, for 3 months in the winter, Joseph Pulitzer. He was among those who took extended stays at the Del Monte. And of course, Pulitzer was running one of the largest newspapers in the country at the time. So to imagine a corporate executive taking 3 months and coming to Monterey, to me, it's mind-boggling.
And without any email or anything.
Yeah, exactly. No Zoom.
So now you got all these tourists staying in your hotel. Well, you got to have stuff for them to do.
Absolutely.
Right? Here's another beautiful view. Let's the color version of that black and white version. And I love this particular sort of bird's eye view of the hotel. You can see the bathhouse and the train station, and just really a neat thing. And so they did have all kinds of activities besides gardens. They had all kinds of different games, and eventually they had the 17-mile drive, which actually initially wasn't 17 miles. It was, and what you would do, you'd go to the hotel kitchen, they'd pack you a lunch, and you would go by horse and buggy. And there was a gentleman who would drive you around in his horse and buggy around, and there are different routes. I think we may have lost John's connection, so we would take you different routes through Monterey. During the squid season, they usually took them up over the Carmel Hill to the Coronation, and then came back around the other way. And then when it wasn't fishing squid, they went around the waterfront and through the Asilomar into the current 17-mile drive, which is about 14 miles, up to the Coronation, all the way back to the hotel, which would take all day to do that kind of thing. And of course, here is the bathhouse here that they built in the bathhouse. It had its own, hotel had its own pier, so ships and yachts would come, so they could moor their boats in the harbor right there. And the bathhouse has 3 swimming pools. They're all saltwater pools, water that was pumped directly from the Monterey Bay, and they all had different temperatures. So one pool was the current temperature of the Monterey Bay, which usually is about 55 degrees. That's the average temperature. And then the next one would be a few degrees warmer, and then the third one be a few degrees warmer than that. It was a lot of people like to go swimming in the pool. There were some problems early on in the early development of the turn of the 20th century, as Monterey sardine fishery began to develop. In the early days, they would just of the sardine fishery, they would just dump the heads, tails, and offal of the fish, the guts, back into the bay. And then the currents, being what they were, would just push that stuff back over to this beach that we call Del Monte Beach. And there were times when the Hotel Del Monte's bathhouse, when it was filling, because they drain the pools every day and then fill them back up with fresh water, there were times when they filled the pool back up and it would be filled with fish guts. So, there's John. So the hotel wasn't all that happy with that kind of thing going on.
Yeah, sorry, my connection seems.
That's fine. I can go. So can you tell me who did this illustration?
Yeah, Tim, I'm not sure.
Okay, that's not. Can you tell me what we're seeing here then? Besides the hotel.
Right. Of course, this is the second Hotel Del Monte. You can tell.
Yes, so there was the fire. The first fire was in
1887.
1887.
And so the hotel, Crocker rebuilt the hotel very quickly and expanded on it. So what you're seeing as the main structure is comparable to the original Hotel Del Monte. The wings that you see on the 2 sides, the east wing and the west wing, those were additions that came because of the response and the demand for lodging. When Del Monte first opened in 1880, Tim, critics called it Crocker's Folly. But when that fire occurred in 1887 and the court case ensued, the manager of the Hotel Del Monte, under testimony, said that there were 17,000 guests coming in the year before the fire. 17,000. So
Wow.
That's pretty remarkable.
That's amazing, actually.
So the main hotel in the foreground, off to the left in the foreground is the clubhouse, which had bowling alley in it, card rooms and smoking lounge, things like that. It was really a retreat for the men in the 19th century. To the right in the foreground, you see a fountain. A little far right in the foreground, you see a fountain, and that leads down to Laguna del Rey, the Lake of the King. Now, what you're seeing around the hotel, the Botanical Park around the hotel, that was the park that Rudolf Ulrich created when he came on board about 1883. So it had already been started, but he started to bring in especially a large number of exotics. So the Botanical Park included tree species from about 60 countries, and the Chinese gardeners apparently maintained it with perfection and immaculately maintained it. In the background to the right, you see the Del Monte Express
Here's Frank, yeah.
steaming in to Monterey. And as you pointed out, the bathhouse is then in the
Yeah.
background. And then Monterey and the road.
Here's the Monterey train station here.
Yeah, right. And the Pueblo of Monterey, and then the road out to this on the drive. And as you were noting, the name of the drive it varied. The hotel, in fact, called it by different terms, especially 17-mile drive and 18-mile drive.
So John, the configuration of the hotel here, how many guests could it hold?
There were over 400 rooms. And so, and the dining room was sized to handle 500 guests at a time. Oh, and on certain special events, Tim, like the 4th of July, there would be times when the people would be spending the night on cots in the hallway. The demand was that great because you'd have what were called excursionists who would come from Santa Cruz and San Francisco and Oakland just for the weekend, or a couple of nights. But you'd also have the sojourners, those who were coming from great distances, who had room reservations. So there were times when the hotel would have 800, 900 people overnight.
So that also was good for the city of Monterey.
That's part of the transformation, the economic, total economic rewriting of Monterey's history.
So we talked a little about that 17-mile drive, and I mentioned the people who go by horse and buggy, and the drivers were called tally-ho drivers. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And one of the projects I've been working on for a long time actually is Abalone history in Monterey, and there was the Abalone tree. Can you want to talk about that for a little bit?
This is great. Dennis Copeland, who did such a great job developing the resources in the California History Room and creating remarkable access for researchers and just people who are curious. Dennis is the person who managed to connect me to that basic story idea. And this came a bit later. I forget the exact year. It was somewhere around 1910 to 1912.
About right, yeah.
Somewhere like that. But one of the tally-ho drivers, at about the location where Starbucks on Lighthouse Avenue is today, there was a tall pine tree that apparently had died. It was about 40 feet tall, and a lot of branches had come down. So someone, maybe the tally-ho driver, but someone had apparently taken the branches, the remaining branches down to avoid damages. And I believe it was Merrick. Anyway, the tally-ho driver collected abalone shells and strung them along the tree. And then when he took people on the drive, he would go by that point and refer to it as the abalone tree because this is where the abalone grow.
As I understand it, they also covered the whole trunk of the tree as well with abalone shell. It must have been beautiful.
It must have been phenomenal, yes.
So those trips were a lot of fun. And I know that you were sort of a cultural history tour. You would stop near the custom house where there was a whale fishery at one point going on there, where you saw Portuguese whalers. And if you're lucky, you got to smell dead whale. Then you would continue along into that, past the abalone tree, then into the Chinese fishing village down there along the where Hopkins is today, where you oftentimes eat your lunch and then continue on the trip into the, or on the Asilomar and then into the current 17-mile drive.
It was both a cultural and a scenic excursion.
Yeah, it must have been.
And you can imagine, Tim, being in a coastal meadow that is in full bloom on a narrow trail that is only wide enough for one carriage at a time, one tally-ho at a time, and but surrounded by this amazing scene of a coastal bluff and meadow, full bloom with the ocean as background. I mean, it just had to be spectacular.
And wasn't there talk at one point of extending the rail line through the 17-mile drive into Carmel?
Crocker himself wanted to do that, was never able to do it for reasons that I'm not fully familiar with. Terry Trotter, his gallery in Pacific Grove, Terry has, in my opinion, reimagined the nature of what an art gallery can be, and his exposés that he and his wife Paula put together are just great educational resources. Terry has a map that shows that proposed rail line, the route for it, and he has it on display. So
Very good.
For those who are really interested in exploring a little bit of the Hotel Del Monte history and seeing some of the realia and artifacts, I hope they'll plan a trip to Terry's gallery.
Oh, I agree with that 100%. That's the best. I think the best museum in Monterey is that gallery.
You know, he has now officially called it a gallery and museum. So his collection, his passion is so evident, and yeah, you'll find things that will totally surprise you.
Absolutely. So let's go out. So besides you on that 17-mile drive trip, and you'll go through Monterey and you look at all those old Tally-Ho Drive will take you through all the old adobes in Monterey. And this may be a place that you will stop. This is like one of the first marine museums. It was, you see abalone shells hanging off the roof, or hanging right here. There was a taxidermist right there. Whalebone book covers. And this is whalebone vertebrae with the Carmel mission painted on it. Whalebone chair, you see right there. I've actually sat in a chair like this one. Not very comfortable, I might add. A whalebone stool. You see, right? This is all things that he was selling to these tourists who were on that trip, going along that way there. But he also played a very important role. And I'm not sure, one of these guys is Manuel Duarte. I'm not sure which one Mr. Duarte is here. Duarte family actually owned a number of businesses along the Monterey waterfront that catered to those tourist trade. They also had glass bottom boat rides. They had a fish market on the wharf and a few other things. But he also worked with the Monterey fishing industry, the commercial fishermen. So in those days, the Monterey commercial fishermen all pretty much fished with hand lines, which is really a hard way to go. And especially when you're fishing large fish like king salmon and things like that, it wasn't really the most effective way to do it. They also fished with gill nets, which was better, but a gill net works much better for salmon anyway in a river than it does in a bay out there. So they weren't really making a lot of money. And so Mr. Duarte actually worked with the commercial fishermen, and he kind of worked like an agent for them. And he worked with the Hotel Del Monte. And I guess he had a contract of some kind with them. And he, no pun intended, would hook these commercial fishermen up with these sport fishermen that were coming to stay at the hotel, and they would take them out in the bay in their boats and show them the good places to fish for salmon in the bay. There were fishing guides like they would do in Europe. This is a mailer that the Hotel Del Monte would send out to those sport fishermen who had been to the hotel. I love this mailer, and you can see our salmon right here and with the line coming here. And then here's our commercial fisherman here, and here's our sport fisherman. And you'll notice that he is wearing a suit.
Yeah.
I believe this guy's name is J. Parker Whitney, actually, who was in this picture.
J. Parker Whitney. He was quite a sportsman,
Yeah, he
fisherman, a racer, hunter. Yeah.
was. Yeah, just the Whitney family, he and his two brothers, they came from Massachusetts during the California gold rush, and they made their fortune not in the gold fields, but in selling supplies to the gold miners. And they also didn't like the wool from the sheep that were in California. So they actually imported a sheep from Australia, and they crossbred that sheep with a sheep from Hollister, and began to create this really fine wool. And they made a lot of money with that. In fact, by the time Mr. Whitney was in his early 30s, he was a very wealthy man and just spent the rest of his life traveling the world, doing things that he loved, which was hunting and fishing. And he spent a lot of time at the Hotel Del Monte. He was close friends with Charles Crocker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Here is the backside of that mailer. And I love this because it shows you all the things that they caught, and they would mark it and then mail it out. But they said, look at the things we caught today: salmon, sea trout, we're not sure what that is, sea bass, tuna, rock cod, barracuda. Barracuda are warm water fishes and are not normally found in the Monterey Bay, which tells me when this was produced, sometime in the 1890s, there was probably an El Nino going on at that time that brought in those warm water fishes, and yellowtail. And then there's an illustration of a salmon rig that was designed by J. Parker Whitney that sort of revolutionized the fishing industry in Monterey for the commercial fishermen. And so here is J. Parker Whitney again, and here is his fishing guide on the Monterey Wharf with all this king salmon that he caught. And what's important about him is he introduced new technology. So he is the first guy to fish in Monterey Bay with a rod and reel. Here it is right here. And he introduced this idea of fishing salmon in the bay with a trolling line, which is a line with a lot of hooks on it that you drag through the bay, which is a really effective way to catch salmon out in that bay out there. So our Monterey commercial fishermen all said, wait a minute, I think we can do that. I have salmon landing records that go back to that time, and you can actually see it. In 1893, they caught 5,000 pounds worth of salmon. Then they switched to Parker's trolling technology. In 1895, they caught over 95,000 pounds worth of salmon in the Monterey Bay, which gets the attention of a guy named Frank Booth, who comes to Monterey to fish salmon, eventually begins to fish sardine, which becomes the largest fishery of a single fish in the history of the United States. All because of this guy right here and his fishing pole and his trolling technology.
It's quite a remarkable story that you've just provided, Tim, of the influence, the really invisible influence that the hotel had, not only on this community, but in the country.
Oh, absolutely. And it's still there today. That's what's so amazing about it. Let's see what I have here next. So here's some more of our salmon fishermen. Around the same time, it was actually pioneering Japanese fishermen that arrived in Monterey right before the turn of the 20th century, set up a fishing camp on present-day Cannery Row down there where they were going to build the fish market or a marketplace kind of thing. And they began to fish salmon in the Monterey Bay. And it was really salmon was king. Salmon was the big fishery in Monterey because of J. Parker Whitney and his technology and the Japanese fishermen. Just to give you an idea of how large it was, at the end of the 1909 salmon season, not too long after this picture was taken, the Monterey Daily Cypress, which was the local newspaper then, reported at the end of that 1909 salmon season that there were 185 salmon boats working the Monterey Bay. 145 of them were Japanese owned, and they were catching an average of 1 million pounds of king salmon in 3 months.
Wow. Wow.
I love this guy with that.
Wow.
big business.
Mm.
So another thing, a connection to the hotel is these are Japanese fishermen here. This is very close to the Monterey Wharf. And the hotel, you really utilize that wharf. That wharf wasn't really a whole lot. Original wharf was built in 1845 with just kind of this kind of rock crib work kind of setup. Then in 1870, the Pacific Steamship Company came in and built a wooden proper wharf there. Then when the hotel opened, they actually began to use that wharf for their guests. And they built this wooden boardwalk you see right here that stretched from the hotel all the way to the Monterey Wharf. Here's a couple of hotel guests, I assume, on their way down to the Monterey Wharf, where they could take glass bottom boat rides and sailboat rides and fishing trips and things like that.
Early recreation trail.
Exactly. And then there was, then right adjacent to the wharf, there are still a beach there, but right to the left of the wharf today. Before the Southern Pacific extended its line into Pacific Grove in 1887, there actually was a pretty large beach there, and they had beach pavilions, and folks would come and the guests could go and spend their day out at the beach, swimming in that cold water of the Monterey Bay.
Tim, a number of years back, you took a group along the recreation trail from the hotel to the wharf, and you did a phenomenal job with your interpretation of the landscape and its history. I hope you're able to do that again someday.
Oh yeah, thanks for reminding me. Thank you. So let's talk about some more kind of recreational things.
Yeah, you mentioned J. Parker Whitney and his influence on the fisheries industry. Whitney also was quite influential in the development of early automobiles. And as it turned out, because the 17-mile drive that R.P. Hammond Sr. had envisioned was engineered with the finest technology of the day, creating the best macadam roadbed that was known to engineers at the time. Because that road existed, the early automobilists would come to Monterey. Some would ship their cars here. Others would make the drive from San Francisco Bay Area or San Jose, and they would hold special events. They would hold rallies and races. They would have competitions for what became known as the Del Monte Run, as they would come from the Bay Area or San Jose and race to Del Monte. And what you see today is called the Monterey Pines Golf Course. The Navy owns it, but it's open to the public. You can drive in. That is where the racetrack was located, the racetrack that Crocker originally built. And when he built the racetrack, the 1 mile oval racetrack in 1880, his very specific instructions to R.P. Hammond Sr. and his son, R.P. Hammond Jr., were to spare no expense on the development of that racetrack. So this became not only a great setting for horse racing in the 19th century, but as automobiles came into existence, great racing and renowned race car drivers who came to Del Monte. So you see in the transition, the lowest image in the graphic is the racetrack from the 19th century with the infield in the background, one person standing along the track, viewers in the middle of in the infield. And then the middle scene is shows you the scale of the grandstand at the hotel's racetrack. This was This was fabulous. The upper image taken in 1923 gives you an idea of the layout of the racetrack. You happen to see a large number of tents around the racetrack, and that's because there was a program called Citizens Military Training Camp that was held at Del Monte for several months during each year for several years, especially large after World War I. So this scene, for example, from 1923, shows you the encampment of the Citizens Military Training Camp. Joe Mora, by the way, the artist, would have been a major in that in the group in that training camp in 1923. And the training camp created scrapbooks. They called him the Bearcat Musketeer. Joe Mora was the editor of the Bearcat Musketeer, and he illustrated it. So if you ever get a chance to see one of these, yeah, I think the Naval Postgraduate School Special Collections and Archives has posted a digital version of it online, but you can't find it in the open internet. You just go to Google Scholar, and I think you find it there.
Oh, very good. So here is a trophy from one of those races. That's again from Terry Trotter.
Yeah, isn't this a great find for Terry?
Yeah, that's second place, but
yeah, and I had a chance to spend an incredible afternoon with Terry and a friend named Greg Birkin, who has done extensive research on the automotive history in the area. And Greg had managed to compile the list of winners for all of the events in this 1908 year when this trophy was among those that were awarded. Fascinating aspect of that, Tim, is that you find there were women drivers who competed and won.
wow.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
great.
So in the 1908 touring car class, the Silver Cup, first place Silver Cup, was won by Mrs. J.W. Skinner. This is from Greg's notes.
Wow.
The 1908 Roadster class, the first place was won by Miss Marion Walcott. She, yeah, and then there was a Silver Cup also presented to Mrs. C.J. Broody for the ladies touring car class.
Wow.
Yeah, there were, I mean, it's
That's great.
The social setting at Del Monte, in my opinion, was far ahead of its time compared to the general
absolutely.
population.
This was won by Fred Edward.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, Terry also has a 1911 Hotel Del Monte guest register, and there was a Del Monte run for the time period that this register covers, and you can see the signatures of people who were involved in the race coming from the Bay Area. It was the award was for fastest event. And so you see the winner of the race as he came to Del Monte, he signed the register, then took off, headed back to the town. But there are other, of course, competitors who were signed into that register. Great, another great historical document that Terry has.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I forgot I had that in there. Of course, the real tree. Who doesn't like sardines and beer? But there is a connection to the hotel and Cannery Row, believe it or not. Well, Cannery Row becomes Cannery Row, right? So Cannery Row really didn't begin to develop till after 1915. And so when the sardine fishery really began to take off in 1915, There were blueprints drawn up. There were plans to build sardine canneries along the Monterey waterfront, starting about where Wharf number 2 is today, stretching all the way along the waterfront there. And the Hotel Del Monte was very, very unhappy with this idea because they were convinced if you build sardine canneries along the waterfront, the tourists won't come to Monterey. And the hotel had a lot of economic and political power here in Monterey. And they actually put a petition out and tried to stop the sardine fishery from even developing in Monterey. And the city of Monterey was considering maybe we shouldn't let them build these canneries. But finally, somebody said, well, wait a minute, there's money to be made here. So that all you sardine canneries go way down there at the end of Ocean View Avenue, Ocean View Boulevard, where nobody goes. And that's how Cannery Row becomes Cannery Row. And Mr. Booth's cannery actually was next to the Monterey Wharf and is the only cannery ever that was in Monterey proper. But again, that shows you the power of the Hotel Del Monte right there.
Yeah, Tim, that's another fantastic element of the unique history of this area. And I really appreciate that you have brought information like this into the Monterey's Magical History Tour, because it really
Thank you.
brings it to life.
So before we run out of time, John, can you just give us what happened to the hotel?
The Roaring Twenties were fantastic at Hotel Del Monte. A young man, Sam Morse, had become initially a part of the Pacific Improvement Company, but then he created the Del Monte Properties Company, the forerunner of today's Pebble Beach Company. And here's an interesting link. R.P. Hammond Sr., who oversaw the development of the original resort, and that resort, by the way, it's the hotel. It's the macadam highway to the forest, the cypress forest. It's an artesian well. It's the railroad. It's the bathhouse. It's the electrical power line, the electrical power plant that he created. It was coal-fired, coal-based, but it created electricity. The plumbing system, because the all indoor plumbing for individual rooms, all of these elements Hammond Sr. created. His other son, John Hayes Hammond, became a noted engineer, mining engineer, and Yale University professor. And it was John Hayes Hammond who recruited Sam Morse, the Yale graduate, to come to California. And that eventually led to Morse's association with Pacific Improvement Company as a liquidator and a subsequent development of the Del Monte Properties Company. So Sam Morse, great times during the Roaring Twenties, but the Depression took its toll. And then war emerged. Morse was a true patriot. The services were ramping up in World War II. The United States had about 450,000 military personnel. That's in all of the services when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And the nation mobilized to a steady standing force of over 7.5 million. There were about 11.5 million men and women who went into the services, but that 450,000 became a steady state of around 7.5 million. Well, the services needed facilities for training and for development for these new personnel. And the Del Monte initially became a pre-flight school on a requisition basis to the Navy, basically a loan, a fee-based loan, if you will, during the wartime emergency. There was and apparently, and I've never found this agreement, but apparently part of the agreement was that the Navy had an option to buy. And they, after some extended negotiations with Morse that went on for years, the Navy exercised that option. The federal government purchased the land and as a campus for the Naval Postgraduate School, which had been at Annapolis since its founding in 1909. So subsequently, the Naval Postgraduate School made the move to Monterey, and that's the basic story on the hotel's transition.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. Thanks for being my guest today.
Tim, thank you for inviting me. This is, I
wish we had more time.
I wish we did too. How about questions?
Yeah, let me stop my sharing here. So if anybody has any questions or?
I do.
Okay.
This was fabulous. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have going back to the hotel. Where did the people who were working at the hotel, what were their lives like? Where were they living? That's one question. Do you know?
Harriet, nice to see you. The hotel created facilities, dormitories for employees, and there were quite a range of facilities that were available. Now, some lived in the community. The former Monterey mayor, Dan Albert, for example, his mother was a housekeeper at the hotel, and they had a little house in the Oak Grove neighborhood. So growing up, Dan and some of his friends used to play on the hotel grounds.
I also know that the Chinese community that worked at the hotel, there was a fourth really Chinese fishing village that was around where the Monterey post office is today, in that area there, and they all lived in that area, in that neighborhood.
Okay, and my other question was the 17-mile drive, which you said wasn't really 17 miles, so that I'm curious about that. But that's interesting. But were other people who were not staying at the resort, were they able to participate, or was it just resort only guests?
There was a fee. There was a fee. The hotel was charged for access to the drive.
So did you have to be a guest, or could you just come and say, I want to participate in the drive? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and in some cases, you could just go to the toll house and pay and go and enter in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This is wonderful.
And I want to say hi to my daughter, Polly. I see her there, all the way in Georgia. She just graduated with her master's in something very complicated that I can't even pronounce.
Hi, Dad.
Hi, Polly. I'm answering for Tim while he's laughing. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
What's your degree in?
Organizational leadership.
Boy, that's a topic for a future discussion, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Any other questions from people on the line?
Well,
Did we answer any chat questions before we log off?
I've been looking at it. No one has asked a question in the chat.
Okay.
So yeah, so far, does anyone else have any final questions?
Yes, I do. I missed the beginning of this. Is the tape going to be available? The
Yes.
recording?
Yes, this will be recorded and put onto the Monterey Public Library's YouTube page as quickly as I can get it up there.
Okay, and just go to the Monterey page and then you'll be able to find it, the Monterey Library page?
Yes, yes,
Thank you.
it'll be up there.
Thank you.
and also, so everybody knows that we'll be, the next show will be on June 17th. It'll be called Pop Goes Monterey, the Monterey Pop Festival. But I'd like to take your suggestions. If you guys have suggestions about anything you'd like me to talk about or any particular historic subject about Monterey, let me know. You can always email me at timsardine@yahoo.com. And even if you have any kind of Monterey question, if I don't know the answer, I guarantee you I will know somebody that does.
And Tim, while you were talking just then, I saw that Nancy Soule entered a question on chat about, I believe it's her grandfather, Benjamin Wright. He was he was a mayor of Monterey and was in charge of the Southern Pacific at Hotel Del Monte for a number of years. And so he wrote a memoir, which highlights, she says not her grandfather, my mistake. But anyway, Benjamin Wright, you can find his memoir, I believe, in the California History Room. Isn't that right, Sean?
Yes. The Ben Wright's memoir.
Benjamin Wright. I think
Yes.
you have it in your collection.
I believe so. I can definitely double check for you, but I believe so.
Mhm.
Um,
And on that note, Sean, do you have any idea when the history room might be able to reopen?
Excellent question, John. So right now the library is finalizing the plans to reopen, and it's looking like at some point in July, the library will be open, and which means the history room will be open. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit different rules than it was before the pandemic, but it will be open. And in addition, you guys can, anyone who wants access to it, what we've been doing is people can email me questions and I can scan some files, do some research for you, and email you information. It's kind of our way of making the room accessible while no one's allowed in. And so you're more than welcome to email myself, and I'll put my email in the chat box.
Great, great. Yeah, you've been a big help, as Dennis was, when I've been needing to tackle some tough research questions.
Oh, thank you, John. Always here to help, and Dennis taught me a lot, so learn from him. We did have one question in the chat. The gallery, I believe it was Terry's Gallery and Museum. Could you guys provide where that's actually located?
It's right across the street from the Pacific Grove City Hall. Forest Avenue, directly across from City Hall.
He's not open every day. Terry is here. Maybe he can answer.
Terry, are you still on?
Maybe not.
He might have. It's not open every
Hey,
day.
can you hear me or not?
Oh, he's still here. Great.
Oh, yeah, okay, hi. Yeah, I was just writing, and yeah, thank you both so much for sharing your wonderful knowledge, and what a passion, and you relay it beautifully. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're on Forest Avenue, 301 Forest Avenue, across from City Hall. Clock Tower is a corner of Forest and Laurel, across from the hardware store. So,
What days of the week are you open, Terry?
gosh, generally it's like Wednesday through Saturday, definitely by 12 to 4:30, but sometimes I'm here, I'm open by 11 sometimes, and it's kind of informal. Sometimes I'm here Mondays or Tuesdays, so, or by appointment, so.
If you get a chance, you guys should all go down and see it. It really is an amazing thing, amazing place.
No, thank you. Yes, by the way, Tim, it's the first time I've heard you. I've listened to John several times, and he's just amazing. But it's wonderful to hear you as well, and I learned so much.
Thank you.
So much that I wasn't aware of, and you expressed it beautifully, and appreciate your years of experience as well.
Well, I appreciate that.
Have time
All
for
right.
one more question?
Yes.
You have time for one more? I was curious. I know there's quite an extensive Hollywood connection to the Hotel Del Monte. There's all kinds of stories of Hollywood celebrities and Hollywood films and so forth. Can you comment on that briefly?
Yes, David, the movie history at Del Monte, there's, I think, some very fertile ground for a researcher to make a lot of headway there. But there were some great silent film stars who came and filmed, and then there were some others. I don't know if you've heard of Reginald Denny. His
Oh, sure.
his movie Sporting Youth, which was filmed almost entirely on location at Hotel Del Monte, picks up on a scenario. The storyline is fascinating because you see initially a couple of men in a boardroom type setting, and one walks to the window, opens the curtains, and you see it, there's a blizzard outside. and, so to address his winter concerns, he's going to Del Monte and he sends Reginald Denny as his driver with his car ahead of him to Del Monte, and the story unfolds from there. And it includes chase scenes and race scenes. It's a silent film, but it's one of the greats. Charlie Chaplin was among the frequent visitors, and in fact, Chaplin married at Del Monte at one point. And yeah, the film legends who went to Del Monte, I think there's some great story material there, great research. I'm not as well informed about it as I'd like to be.
Thank you, John. That's interesting, though.
John, could you provide the name of the film that you were just discussing?
Oh, Sporting Youth. It was, and what's especially interesting about it, Sean, is that it was released in 1924, but the footage was shot in 1923. So what you see is the hotel before its second major fire. That second fire occurred in September of 1924. Yeah, Reginald Denny, in fact, the car that's centerpiece in that was a Packard, a special boat tail Packard that set the world land speed record at 150 miles per hour. Packard only made 2 of them.
Oh, thank you. Got a couple more questions that popped in. Did the guest registries get lost during the 2 fires, or did they possibly survive?
Some survived. Tim may know of more. Terry has 1911, I think from June to August of 1911. The Pebble Beach Company owns a few registers. Tim, do you know of anyone else who has guest registers?
Well, as I remember, is the gentleman who was the bartender at the Navy School. He had a couple of them.
That was Peter. I just muted myself.
Terry's got his. Okay.
Yeah.
We had those on exhibit at the Maritime Museum. I did an exhibit on Hotel Del Monte 12 years ago, and we had them on exhibit.
Right. Yeah. Wonderful. That's actually in 1910. You're pretty close there, John.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's good.
And they're fun to look at. They're really, really fun to look at.
It's amazing. Yeah, you mentioned Frank Booth, obviously, and he had his primary residence was up in San Francisco, but he had his favorite, very exceptional room that he stayed in frequently, coming down and staying at the Hotel Del Monte, as with so many others as well from San Francisco, Oakland area. It's interesting.
Yes, and I believe the library has a copy or has a Hotel Del Monte guest registry that was gifted to us also.
Oh, wonderful.
So that's another place.
There you go.
We have another question. Can any of you share anything about the foundation that was standing in the Monte Vista area for years? The Monterey Elks Club is now there. I've been told that it was intended to be the river resort for the Del Monte Hotel.
Uh,
I have no clue.
yeah, me either.
Okay, something to look up.
Yeah,
All right, well, we're coming up to our hour and we're gonna be closing this up. I just want to say a special thank you to Tim Thomas and John Sanders for a very informative and very entertaining presentation. I've learned so much and greatly appreciate it to the both of you.
that's the plan. That's the idea.
Yeah.
That was very fun. Just as a reminder, we'll be doing this monthly. And our next one is June 17th. And I believe you said it was the Pop Festival, History of the
right.
Pop Festival.
Monterey
So-
goes pop.
Monterey
Pop
goes.
goes Monterey.
And so people can register on the library's website again, like they did for this one. And that's it. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. And if
My
anyone has
pleasure.
suggestions, I placed Tim and my email address in the chat. So please let us know of any topics that you'd like to hear from.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sean.
Thank you, John.
Great being with you, Tim.
Yeah, same here. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you both. And thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Hi, Polly.